The Chicago humidity clung to the city like a wet, heavy shroud, thick with the smell of exhaust and Lake Michigan salt, refusing to lift even as the sun dipped below the skyscrapers. Inside the gilded crane, the air was filtered and freezing, a manufactured winter that bit at Karen's dark skin, reminding her that she didn't belong in the climate of the wealthy. It was nearly midnight, but the neon pulse of the lounge showed no signs of slowing. The air was a suffocating mix of expensive oud, Szechuan peppercorns, and the metallic tang of chilled silver. It was an atmosphere of vicious elegance, a place where millionaires came to hide their sins in plain sight. Karen M. Garibai moved through the haze in a blue shirt that felt like lead against her shoulders, her salt-stained fatigue hidden beneath a layer of professional poise. She had been on her feet for 12 hours, her arches screaming, her mind tallying the late fees on her rent. She navigated the floor like a ghost, a program of service written into her DNA. She saw the fake laughter of trophy wives and the sweating palms of mid-level fixers, but she remained a shadow. She had mastered the art of being the help, there when needed, invisible when not. To the men in this room, she was as part of the furniture as the velvet booths. That was their first mistake. The humidity of the Chicago night didn't stop at the heavy oak doors of the gilded crane. It transformed into a different kind of pressure. Inside, the air was a pressurized blend of expensive oud, Szechuan peppercorns, and the metallic tang of chilled silver. It was a climate of vicious elegance, a world where the wealthy came to hide their sins behind layers of lace and crystal. Karen M. Garibai moved through this manufactured winter in a blue shirt that felt like lead against her shoulders. Every movement was a calculation, a rhythm of the ignored that she had perfected over 3 years of surviving on the periphery of power. She had been on her feet for 12 hours. The salt-stained fatigue wasn't just a physical weight in her lower back or the burning fire in her arches. It was a psychological fog she had to fight through to remain sharp. In a place like this, sharp was the only way to stay safe. Karen didn't just carry trays, she navigated a minefield of fragile egos and dangerous secrets. She had learned to read the room through reflections, the way a man's grip tightened on his scotch glass when a certain name was mentioned, or the predatory stillness of a table when the conversation turned to logistics. To the clientele of the gilded crane, Karen was part of the architecture. She was the ghost in the blue jacket, a silent provider of napkins and refills who existed only in the peripheral vision of the city's elite. It was a status that had once wounded her pride, but now it was her greatest asset. She saw the sweat on the brow of a senator who was losing a gamble he couldn't afford. She noticed the way the trophy wives looked at their husbands with eyes that were as cold as the ice in their chablis. She was the record keeper of things no one wanted to name aloud. Tonight, the lounge buzzed with a frantic Friday night energy. The rhythm of the ignored kept Karen moving, weaving through the thick crowds where laughter was often too loud and the toasts were too frequent to be sincere. She kept her head down, her expression a mask of professional neutrality, friendly enough to be approachable, but distant enough to be forgotten the moment she turned away. But as she approached the VIP section, the air seemed to compress, becoming denser and colder. This was the territory of the untouchables, the men whose influence didn't appear on tax forms or in society columns. Karen's pulse quickened, a subtle drumbeat against her ribs that she had learned to suppress. She knew the stakes of this section. Here, a spilled drink wasn't just a mistake, it was an insult. And in this world, insults were settled in ways that didn't involve a manager's office. She adjusted the silver tray on her hand, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion screaming in her joints.
She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a spectator at a play where the actors didn't know she was watching from the wings. She moved toward table 4, the seat of the most powerful man in the room, her eyes already scanning the shadows for the subtle shifts in the routine she had come to rely on for survival. The rent was due, the landlord was waiting, and the city was indifferent. But for now, Karen was the only one in the room who truly saw the board. The transition from the main floor to the VIP terrace of the Gilded Crane was marked by a sudden artificial silence that made the blood in Karen's ears hum. Here, the shadows were deeper, designed to provide the kind of privacy that only high-level debt or dangerous power could purchase. Table 4 sat anchored in the center of this quiet, a fortress of mahogany and silk, where Chin Hae Chul presided over his empire. Karen approached with a fresh bottle of sparkling water, her movements fluid and practiced, but her internal focus was no longer on the tray. It was on the man standing precisely 3 feet behind Chin Hae's left shoulder. Alex S. Slayton had always been a study in absolute stillness. For the 6 months Karen had served this table, Slayton had existed as a permanent extension of the boss's authority. A human wall with eyes that swept the room like a lighthouse beam, never lingering, never blinking. He was a professional who understood that his life was the shield. But tonight, as Karen drew closer, she felt a microscopic fracture in that wall. It began with his stance. Usually, Slayton stood with his weight centered, his hands clasped low, ready to move in any direction at a heartbeat's notice. Tonight, his weight was shifted forward onto the balls of his feet, leaning away from Chin Hae rather than toward him. It was a subtle, predatory tilt. He wasn't guarding the man in the chair, he was creating a gap. Karen slowed her pace, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the starch of her blue shirt. She caught Slayton's reflection in the polished chrome of a nearby ice bucket. His eyes, usually fixed on the entrance, were darting toward the service corridor every 10 seconds, a rhythmic, nervous tick that smelled of betrayal. He wasn't looking for threats to neutralize, he was looking for a signal to begin. As she reached the table to pour the water, the air felt thick, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by the tension radiating from the bodyguard. Chin Hae was focused on a ledger, his face a mask of controlled rage and intense focus, his tattooed fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the table. He was a man who commanded the air around him, yet he was completely oblivious to the fact that his shadow had grown teeth.
Karen's hand trembled slightly as she tilted the bottle. In that moment she saw it, the glitch that confirmed her dread. Slayton reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for a burner phone. He didn't look at it. He simply pressed a button and slid it back into his pocket, all while shifting his body 6 inches to the right. To an untrained eye, it looked like a man adjusting his suit. To Karen, who had spent years learning to see the things people wanted to hide, it was a tactical maneuver. He was clearing the line of sight from the service door directly to the back of Chin Hae Chul's. The realization settled over her like a layer of ice. Slayton wasn't just failing his job, he was positioning the target. He had turned the boss into a payment to be delivered. Karen looked down at the table, her dark reflection staring back at her from the polished wood, and she realized that the invisible woman was the only one who saw the knife before it struck. The rhythm of her life, the quiet, invisible service, was over. The next move wouldn't be about a tip, it would be about a life. The cold within the VIP terrace seemed to deepen, a sharp contrast to the humid Chicago night pressing against the glass. Karen retreated from table 4, her silver tray pressed against her chest like a shield. Her mind was a chaotic blur of the glitch she had just witnessed, Slayton's tactical shift, the burner phone, the cleared line of sight. She needed a moment of stillness, a breath of air that didn't taste like betrayal, so she slipped through the heavy velvet curtains into the service hallway that led toward the coat check and the private restrooms.
The hallway was a dim, narrow artery of the lounge, lined with polished wood and the muffled echoes of distant jazz. It was here, in the shadows between the public luxury and the private offices, that the true business of the Gilded Crane was often transacted. Karen slowed her steps, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the runner. Just ahead, tucked into the alcove near the emergency exit, two silhouettes were silhouetted against the amber glow of a wall sconce. She recognized the broad, stiff shoulders of Alex Slayton immediately. He was leaning in close to a man in a gray wool coat, the same stranger she had seen nodding from across the room. Karen pressed herself into a shallow doorway, her heart hammering so violently she feared it would bruise her ribs. She was a ghost again, a dark-complexioned shadow blending into the dark wood, utilizing the invisibility that had been her lifelong burden. "Is the perimeter clear?" the stranger whispered, his voice a jagged rasp. "I've moved the rotation," Slayton replied, his voice devoid of the loyalty he had projected for years. It was clinical, the voice of a man checking a manifest. "The service door is unlocked, 2 minutes after the lights dip for the floor show." The stranger let out a low, dry chuckle. "And the boss? Does he have any idea his shadow has detached?" "He's focused on the ledgers. He thinks he's untouchable," Slayton said. There was a brief pause, the sound of a heavy envelope changing hands, the dry slide of paper against paper. "What's the final count?" 200,000, plus the South Side territory once the transition is complete. A small price for the head of Chin-Hae Chol, don't you think? Karen felt a sickening jolt in her stomach. $200,000. To her, it was an unimaginable fortune, enough to end the angry knock of her landlord forever. But in the world of the Korean Mafia, for a man like Chin-Hae, who moved millions with a single phone call, it was an insult. He wasn't being assassinated for a king's ransom. He was being sold for a fraction of his worth. His life, his empire, and the safety of everyone in his orbit were being liquidated like floor samples in a clearance sale. "He's worth more than that dead," Slayton muttered, his voice cold and transactional. "He's the payment for the new alliance. Just make sure it's clean. I don't want to be cleaning his blood off my suit when the new management arrives." The stranger nodded, the light catching a jagged scar across his knuckles. 2 minutes. Don't miss your cue." They split apart, Slayton heading back toward the VIP terrace with the effortless poise of a trusted guardian, and the stranger disappearing through the exit. Karen remained frozen in the doorway, the tray in her hand suddenly feeling like a lead weight. The rhythm of the ignored had brought her a truth that was too heavy to carry. Chin-Hae Chol, the man who commanded the air around him, was currently a dead man sitting, sold out by his most loyal soldier for a mid-sized payout and a promise of territory. She looked at her hands, dark and trembling in the dim light. She was just a waitress in a blue shirt with rent she couldn't pay. She could walk away, clock out, and disappear into the humid Chicago night, letting the blood flow where it may. But as she thought of Chin-Hae's focused, intense face, the face of a man who for the first time was reacting rather than commanding, she felt a spark of quiet courage ignite beneath her fatigue. She wasn't just a spectator anymore. She was the only one who knew the price of a soul in this room, and she was the only one who could stop the transaction. The air in the service station was thick with the smell of stale coffee and industrial-strength cleaner, a stark contrast to the expensive tobacco and Szechuan spices drifting from the VIP terrace. Karen leaned against the cold stainless steel counter, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Her hands, dark-complexioned and usually steady from years of balancing heavy trays, were trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the prep table to stay upright. She had exactly 2 minutes before the floor show began, 2 minutes before the lights would dip and the man she had served for 6 months would become a ghost. She reached into the pocket of her black jacket, her fingers brushing against a crumpled order pad and a cheap ballpoint pen. Her mind raced, discarding sentence after sentence. If she was too vague, Chin-Hae would ignore it. If she was too wordy, he wouldn't finish reading before the first shot was fired. It had to be a blade, short, sharp, and impossible to misunderstand. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, she clicked the pen. The sound seemed to echo like a gunshot in the narrow hallway. She flattened the small slip of paper against the counter. "Your loyal bodyguard sold you out," she began, the ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. She paused, her eyes darting toward the curtain. She could almost feel Slayton's presence on the other side, his cold, transactional gaze scanning the room, his weight shifted forward in that predatory tilt. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force it felt like a physical blow. She knew that if Slayton walked through that curtain right now and saw what she was doing, her body would be the first one found in the alleyway. She was a waitress. She was supposed to be invisible. She was supposed to care about tips and rent and the throbbing ache in her lower back. She wasn't supposed to be the one deciding the fate of a Mafia empire. "You're the payment," she finished, her handwriting jagged and raw. She stared at the words, 20 words that could cost her everything. She folded the note with trembling fingers, sliding it deep into the leather bill folder where the evening's check sat waiting. She tucked it behind the credit card slot, ensuring only the corner was visible, just enough to catch a man's eye, but not enough for a bodyguard standing 3 feet away to see. Karen took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing her blue shirt and forcing her face into the mask of professional neutrality she had worn for 3 years. She had to be the ghost again. She had to walk back into that room, look the traitor in the eye, and deliver a death sentence to a conspiracy. She wasn't just carrying a check anymore. She was carrying the only thing in the gilded crane that Slayton hadn't accounted for, the observation of a woman no one bothered to see. She stepped through the velvet curtains and back into the freezing manufactured winter of the VIP terrace. The lights were already beginning to dim. Slayton was back in position, his eyes fixed on the service door. Chul sat at the center of the storm, tapping his tattooed fingers on the mahogany table, unaware that the air around him had already turned lethal. Karen moved forward, her steps silent on the plush carpet, her eyes locked on the leather folder in her hand. The gamble had begun. The golden house lights of the VIP terrace began their slow, cinematic fade, signaling the start of the evening's floor show. In the deepening amber glow, the air became heavy, charged with the static of an impending storm. Karen moved through the dimness toward table 4, the leather bill folder clutched in her hand like a live wire. Her steps were steady, the rhythm of the ignored served her one last time, but inside she was a frantic pulse of adrenaline and terror. She arrived at the table's edge just as the overhead spotlight tightened its focus on the stage, leaving the corners of the room in deep velvet shadow. Chul didn't look up. He remained a statue of ink and silk, his gaze fixed on the ledger before him, a man so accustomed to being the predator that he had forgotten how it felt to be the prey. 3 feet behind him, Alex Slayton was a silhouette of betrayal. The bodyguard's eyes were no longer scanning the room. They were locked on the service door, his hand hovering near his waist, waiting for the lights to hit total black. With a hand that felt disconnected from her body, Karen leaned into the circle of light at the table. She slid the bill folder onto the mahogany surface, placing it directly over the ledger. Her fingers brushed the wood, and for a fleeting second, her dark skin contrasted sharply with the pale, tattooed hand of the Mafia boss. "Your check, Mr. Chul," she whispered. Her voice was thin, a mere thread of sound that barely carried over the rising swell of the lounge's jazz orchestra. Chin-Hei's hand stilled. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers stopped. He looked up, his deep, piercing eyes meeting hers. For a moment, the world truly went silent. The clinking of crystal, the distant laughter, and the hum of the city seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of them in a vacuum of high-stakes recognition. He saw the vulnerability and quiet courage in her expression, the look of a woman who knew she was standing on a trapdoor. His gaze flicked down to the folder. He saw the corner of the white slip of paper she had tucked behind the leather. With a slow, deliberate motion, he opened the folder. Beside him, Slayton stiffened. The bodyguard's head turned slightly, his suspicion flaring. "Sir?" Slayton's voice was a low growl, a warning of its own. "Is there a problem with the bill?" Chin-Hei didn't answer. He read the 20 words Karen had scribbled in the service station. "Your loyal bodyguard sold you out. You're the payment." The transformation was instantaneous. The controlled rage that usually simmered beneath his skin broke the surface. His pupils contracted, and a predatory sharpness settled over his features. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. He simply closed the folder with a soft thud and looked back at Karen. In that look, the hierarchy of the room shifted. She was no longer the waitress, and he was no longer the untouchable king. They were two people bound by a lethal truth. "Waitress," Chin-Hei said, his voice like grinding stones. "Yes, sir?" "The wine you recommended," he said, his eyes shifting microscopically to catch Slayton's reflection in the silver ice bucket. "It's corked. We need to leave, now." Before Slayton could react to the routine, Chin-Hei stood, his broad shoulders blocking the bodyguard's line of sight to the service door. The lights dipped to a final, absolute black. In the darkness, Karen felt a hand grip her upper arm, firm, protective, and dangerous. "Stay close," Chin-Hei hissed into the gloom.
The floor show began with a crash of cymbals, but the real performance was happening in the shadows of Table 4. The gamble had been taken, the note had been read, and the invisible woman had just pulled the pin on a grenade. Now the only question was who would survive the blast. The darkness of the VIP terrace was absolute for only a heartbeat before it was shattered. The floor show's opening act, a dramatic explosion of pyrotechnics on the main stage, provided the perfect acoustic cover for the first blow. But it wasn't a gunshot that broke the silence. It was the sound of a heavy crystal decanter connecting with the side of Alex Slayton's head. Chin-Hei had moved with the terrifying economy of a man who had survived a dozen such betrayals. As the lights dipped, he hadn't reached for the exit. He had reached for the weapon of opportunity. Slayton, caught in the mid-motion of drawing his own sidearm, crumpled against the mahogany table. The loyal bodyguard fell into the very gap he had cleared for the assassins, his burner phone skittering across the floor like a useless plastic shell. "Move," Chin-Hei hissed, his hand clamping onto Karen's shoulder with a grip that felt like iron. He didn't lead her toward the service door where the gray-coated stranger was waiting. Instead, he swung her toward the heavy velvet curtains that led to the private tasting room. Just as they breached the fabric, the service door kicked open. Muffled thuds, suppressed rounds bit into the wood of Table 4, shredding the leather chair where Chin-Hei had been sitting seconds before. The rhythm of the ignored was gone, replaced by a high-octane blur of survival. Karen's breath came in ragged, burning gasps as Chin-Hei navigated the labyrinthine back corridors of the Gilded Crane. They moved through the scent of old wine and damp stone, descending a narrow iron staircase that rattled under their weight. Karen's lower back throbbed and her calves burned, but the exhaustion that had plagued her for 12 hours was incinerated by the raw heat of adrenaline. They burst through a heavy steel door and into the salt-heavy air of the back docks. The Chicago humidity was a physical wall, thick with the smell of river water and rotting wood. To their left, the dark expanse of the Chicago River churned. To their right, the narrow alleyway was a canyon of brick and shadow. "The black USV," Chin-Hei commanded, pointing toward a vehicle idling without lights at the far end of the pier. Halfway there, the glass of a warehouse window above them shattered. A hail of shards rained down like jagged diamonds. The assassins hadn't given up. They had anticipated the exit. A figure appeared on the fire escape above, the silhouette of a rifle barrel catching the distant neon glow of the city.
Karen didn't think. She didn't hesitate. As a waitress, she had learned to anticipate a customer's needs before they voiced them. She saw the shooter's shadow move before he pulled the trigger. She shoved Chin-Hei toward the cover of a stack of wooden crates, just as a bullet sparked against the concrete where he had been standing. Chin-Hei spun, pulling a compact, blackened pistol from a hidden holster beneath his silk jacket. He fired 2 precise shots upward. The figure on the fire escape vanished into the darkness.
"You have a knack for timing, Karen M. Garibay," Chin-Hei said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He didn't look back to see if the shooter was dead. He reached the SUV and tore the door open, practically lifting Karen into the leather interior before sliding in beside her. As the vehicle roared to life and tires screeched against the wet pavement, Karen looked back at the receding silhouette of the lounge. The manufactured winter was behind her. The blue shirt was stained with sweat and dust, and the girl who was afraid of an angry knock on her door was gone. She was in the back of a hardened vehicle with a man who had just seen her save his life. The glass had shattered, and in the wreckage, a new version of Karen was beginning to take shape. The adrenaline that had sustained Karen through the dockside escape evaporated the moment the heavy door of her apartment clicked shut. Her small studio in Logan Square felt different now, smaller, more fragile, like a cardboard box sitting in the path of a hurricane. She sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing the blue shirt that now smelled of river water and gun smoke, staring at the peeling wallpaper until the sun began to bleed through the blinds. She expected a phone call, a police siren, or a knock from the landlord. She didn't expect the silence to last 3 days. On the 4th evening, the knock finally came. It wasn't the frantic, aggressive pounding of her landlord, Mr. Henderson. It was a single, heavy thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Karen froze, her heart climbing into her throat. She approached the door and looked through the peephole. Her breath hitched. Standing in the dim, yellow-lit hallway was Chin-Hei Chul. He was alone, devoid of the security detail that usually acted as his human perimeter. He wore a dark charcoal suit that looked like armor, his expression unreadable, his presence seemingly compressing the narrow hallway around him. She opened the door, her hands trembling as they had at table 4. "Mr. Chul." "Karen M. Garibay," he said. His voice was a low rumble that made the loose coins on her dresser rattle. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the cramped space, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the single window with the view of the fire escape, the visible struggle of a woman living on the edge of invisibility. He looked entirely out of place, a wolf in a birdcage. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Karen whispered, leaning against the doorframe for support. "I thought, after the docks, you'd want to forget I existed." Chin-Hei turned to face her, his tattooed hands clasped behind his back. "Most people in this city look at me and see a target. Some see a paycheck. Very few see the knife behind my back. You saw what my own shadow missed." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a heavy blanket. "I don't leave debts unpaid. Alex Slayton is gone. The men who bought him are being liquidated. But that leaves a void in my organization, a vacancy for someone who knows how to watch without being seen."
He reached into his pocket. Karen expected an envelope of cash, a tip that would cover her rent for a year, a thank you for saving his life. Instead, he pulled out a small, heavy silver pendant. It was an abstract design, sharp-edged and cold, hanging from a thick chain. "I'm not here to give you a tip, Karen. A tip is for a servant. A tip is for someone you intend to forget," Chin-Hei said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stripped away her defenses. "I am here to offer you a seat at the table. You have spent your life being ignored. I am offering you the chance to make that your greatest weapon. No more blue shirts, no more 12-hour shifts for people who don't know your name."
Karen looked at the pendant, then at the man who had survived a massacre because of her 20-word gamble. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it was a growing flicker of hunger. The world she lived in had tried to crush her. The world he offered might destroy her, but she would never be invisible again. "What would I be?" she asked, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity. "A ghost," Chin-Hei replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "My ghost, the one who sees the glitch before the glass shatters." He laid the pendant on her small kitchen table, right on top of the final eviction notice. "If you put that on, the waitress dies tonight. You will go to a place where they will forge that quiet courage of yours into something lethal. You will learn to play the board instead of being a pawn on it." He walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "The car will be downstairs at midnight. Don't be late. I hate to wait for my investments." As the door closed behind him, the silence of the apartment rushed back in, but the air felt different now. Karen looked at the silver pendant gleaming under the flickering light bulb. She reached out, her fingers closing around the cold metal. The debt was being called in, and the payment was her old life. She didn't hesitate. She put the chain around her neck, the weight of it feeling like the first real thing she had ever owned. The black SUV that arrived at midnight didn't take Karen to a palace. It took her to a windowless warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, where the smell of diesel and Lake Michigan's rot replaced the refined scents of the lounge. The initiation began before she even stepped out of the vehicle. There were no welcoming speeches. There was only a woman named Min, a sharp-featured associate of Chin-Hei's with eyes like obsidian, who stripped Karen of her cell phone, her old clothes, and the lingering softness of her former life.
For the next 2 weeks, Karen existed in a world of blurred corners and sensory overload. Chin-Hei's world was not built on brute force alone. It was built on the collection and weaponization of details. Karen was forced into a grueling psychological regimen designed to break the pawn and forge the observer. She was placed in rooms filled with 40 people and given 10 seconds to identify who was carrying a concealed weapon, who was lying about their identity, and who was looking for the exit. When she failed, she wasn't yelled at. She was simply left in the dark until she could recall the exact color of a stranger's cufflinks or the rhythm of a traitor's breath. "You spent 3 years being invisible because you were afraid," Min told her during a session in a room filled with flickering monitors. "Now you will be invisible because you are the hunter. People do not look at waitresses, Karen. They do not look at the cleaning crew, the valets, or the ghosts in the hallway. That is where the power sits." Karen learned the art of controlled presence. She practiced moving through a room without displacing the air, learning to synchronize her footsteps with the ambient noise of a crowd. She was taught how to plant microtransmitters in the time it took to clear a dinner plate, and how to read a man's intentions by the tension in his jawline. Her salt-stained fatigue was replaced by a cold, clinical alertness. The exhaustion was still there, but it was no longer a burden. It was a sharpening stone. The breaking point came during a simulation in a mock-up of a high-stakes gambling den. Karen was tasked with identifying a mole among a group of seasoned enforcers. For hours, she served drinks, moved chairs, and played the part of the invisible help. She felt the old urge to shrink, to hide from the cold gazes of the powerful men in the room. But as she saw a man reach for a hidden burner phone, a mirror of Slayton's betrayal, the fear didn't paralyze her, it transformed. She didn't drop a note this time. She leaned in, ostensibly to refill a glass, and whispered a single, devastating fact into the ear of the simulation's boss that exposed the traitor. She did it without breaking her stride, without a tremor in her hand, and without looking the traitor in the eye. When the lights came up, Chin-Hai was standing in the doorway, watching from the shadows.
He didn't applaud, he simply looked at the silver pendant resting against her collarbone, the weight she had chosen over her old life. "The pawn is dead," he said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "The board is yours now, Karen." She looked at her reflection in the glass of a monitor. The dark-complexioned girl in the blue shirt was gone. In her place was a woman with a piercing focus that stripped away defenses. She had learned the most dangerous lesson of the underground. The most powerful person in the room is the one no one bothers to watch. She was no longer a spectator of her own life. She was the ghost that haunted the Empire's enemies.
The return to the Gilded Crane was not a homecoming, but a haunting. The Chicago night was still thick with humidity, and the scent of expensive oud and Szechuan spices still hung in the air. But the girl who had once been crushed by the weight of it was gone. Karen M. Garibay stepped through the heavy oak doors, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't head for the employee lockers. She wasn't wearing the blue shirt of a servant or the salt-stained fatigue of the invisible. She wore a perfectly tailored black suit that absorbed the light, her dark complexion radiant against the silver pendant that now sat openly against her throat. She moved through the lounge with a controlled presence that made the air seem to part for her. She was no longer synchronizing her steps with the ambient noise. She was the one setting the rhythm. As she passed the service station, where she had once frantically scribbled a 20-word gamble, she didn't look back. She didn't have to. The ghosts of her past life had been exorcised in the warehouses of the industrial district. Table 4 was waiting. It was no longer shielded by the weeping bamboo, but set in the center of the terrace, a declaration of reclaimed territory. Jinhae Chul sat in his usual chair, his tattoos signaling authority and his eyes fixed on the entrance. When he saw Karen, he didn't command her to serve. He simply gestured to the chair directly opposite him. Karen sat. The leather was cool, the mahogany table solid beneath her hands. For a moment, the ghost of Alex Slayton seemed to flicker in the peripheral vision of the room, but Karen didn't flinch. She leaned back, her gaze sweeping the room with a clinical, predatory sharpness. She wasn't looking at the menus or the wine list. She was watching the reflections in the polished chrome of the ice bucket and the brass rails of the bar. She saw the glitches before they even formed. She noticed the way a new valet lingered too long near the back exit. She saw the nervous twitch in the hand of a rival lieutenant 3 tables away. She saw the world as Jinhae saw it, as a board where every piece had a price and every shadow had a purpose. "The room is loud tonight," Jinhae said, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "It's a room full of people trying to be seen," Karen replied, her voice steady and stripped of its former vulnerability. "They're so busy performing that they don't notice the ones who are actually watching." Jinhae reached across the table, not to hand her a tip, but to slide a thin, encrypted tablet toward her. It contained the names of the new security detail, the logistics for the South Side transition, and the dossiers of the men who had tried to turn him into payment. "I told you that you would learn to define yourself," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a level of respect that no amount of money could buy. "What do you see now, Karen?" Karen looked out over the lounge. She saw the waitresses in their blue shirts moving with the rhythm of the ignored, and she felt a brief, sharp pang of recognition. But then she looked at the silver pendant around her neck and the man across from her who had seen her when she was a ghost. She said, "I see a board," she finally said, her fingers tracing the edge of the mahogany table, "and I see that it's finally my turn to move." She was no longer the help. She was no longer a spectator. She was the one who watched the reflections, the one who saw the knife before it struck, and the one who ensured that in the city of Chicago, the invisible woman would never be forgotten again. The seat at the table wasn't just a reward for saving a life. It was the place where Karen M. Garibay finally became the master of her own.